Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Professor Wang Gang-Hu, the chairman of the Lee Kuan Yew School, the Dean, Kishore Mahbubani, who's in some exotic place like Kazakhstan, marketing his book. No, I'm serious. He's marketing his third book. I have very great pleasure in welcoming you to this lecture and to introduce our distinguished speaker. Professor Huang and I have known Chris Patten for many years, and I'm an admirer of his. Why do I admire him? First, many people do not know that Chris Patten is the son of Irish immigrants to Britain, and that he's the first member of his family who went to university. So I regard him as the poster boy of British meritocracy, because he's ascended to the highest peak of British society, but all on his merit, based upon his intellectual brilliance, his hard work, and his ability. He worked for the Conservative Party first in the research department, and subsequently he plunged into politics himself. He has served Britain in several capacities. He was a junior minister for Northern Ireland. He was the Minister for Overseas Development. And he was Minister for a very important portfolio, the environment. He would have become Prime Minister if he were not such a good chairman of the Conservative Party. He worked so hard to ensure that his party would triumph in the 92 elections that he neglected his own seat and lost his own seat in the elections. So one of the respected newspapers of Great Britain, The Observer, said, and this is a great tribute to Chris Patten, that he's the best Prime Minister Great Britain never had. Yeah. It's a great tribute to him. But many of us will remember him as the last British governor of Hong Kong. And whatever you may say about the manner in which he performed his duties as governor of Hong Kong, but looking back from the vantage point of 2008 to Hong Kong today, we have to say that he's left Hong Kong with a very good legacy. Hong Kong remains a prosperous economy. Hong Kong remains both a Chinese city and a global city. Hong Kong is one of the most globalized cities in Asia. Hong Kong has 3 great universities, one of which Gang-Hu was Vice Chancellor of, Hong Kong University, the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and the Chinese University. The rule of law continues to be observed in Hong Kong. And I would say that there are only 2 cities in Asia which have the prospects of becoming the global cities of Asia, and these are Hong Kong and Singapore. But I also want to pay tribute to another one of his persona. He was the Commissioner for External Affairs of the European Commission. And I was very fortunate that during the period when he was Commissioner, I was given the privilege of starting and then being the first Executive Director of the Asia-Europe Foundation. I can say, Chris, that I'm really grateful to you, because in you I found a commissioner who was supportive, who was thoughtful, and who gave me good advice whenever I went to see you in Brussels. So I'd like to publicly acknowledge my enormous debt to you. Today, Chris Patten is the co-chairman of the International Crisis Group, which does a lot of good work around the world. He's the Chancellor of Oxford University and Sheffield University. He has many other responsibilities, but I won't talk about them. I want to talk about him as a thinker and author. He is the author of 4 books, and the lecture today is based upon his 4th and latest book called What Next? This is when I received this book a week ago, I diligently plowed through it in preparation for today. And I can commend the book to you. It's a very good book. It's really about where we are in the 21st century. What are the great challenges that we face, and how should we respond? I wouldn't say too much about his thesis, but I will just give you a few insights. He begins by saying that, contrary to many political scientists' theories, that we still live in a world of nation-states. And I think there's no quarrel with this in Asia. The Asian political scientists and thinkers all think that this is surely a reality. Why is there a debate about this? But the important point he goes on to make is, however, that the concept of sovereignty needs to be re-examined. That it should not be the narrow-minded sovereignty of the past, but a sovereignty in which it is in the individual and collective interests of nation-states to pool their sovereignty, much like the EU member states have done, and to work together in order to respond to the many global challenges that we face. The book then takes you on a tour of the many challenges we face in different areas. And I would describe Lord Patten as a hard-headed internationalist, someone who believes very strongly that narrow-minded espousal of sovereignty and nationalism is a wrong way to go. And like Senator Obama, he's a strong critic of the Bush administration. He's an internationalist because he believes that many of the planetary challenges we face today cannot be solved by any single country, no matter how powerful. So it is with very great pleasure that we welcome him to the Lee Kuan Yew School, and it gives me great, enormous pleasure to invite him to speak to us. Lord Patten, please.
Professor Wang, Ambassador Tommy, first of all, thank you very much indeed for that charming introduction, which, as an American senator once said, my father would have much enjoyed, and which my mother would have believed. You were extremely kind. And it's a great pleasure to be back at this School of Public Policy. I do so only with one minatory thought, and that is one of my ambitions for Oxford University is that one day we too should have a School of Public Policy. It's in many respects absurd that we don't. I was looking the other day at the names of the three best-known young Asian or African-American politicians in the United States. All of them in their 30s were alumni of Oxford University, and it's completely crazy that we don't have a school as well, and I hope one day we can repair that deficit and build as fine a school as you've built here. So it's a great pleasure to be back again. I guess it's partly to find our way around our own past that we have over the years found it convenient, even necessary, to divide our history into what seem to be suitable chunks. In Europe, we begin with the Homeric Age, go on to the Roman Empire, move on from there through the Dark Ages and the medieval history to the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution. But when does modern history, when does the contemporary world begin? I read history at Oxford University. I went up to the university in 1962 to read modern history, which in Oxford in those days started in 410. This was regarded as rather daring because it was 410 after the birth of Christ rather than before the birth of Christ. It was the year in which Alaric pillaged Rome and the year in which the Roman legions were withdrawn from Britain. 1962, now part of an age which is regarded as a historic era, as much a piece of history as the days of the Holy Roman Empire. The 1960s, the first term I was at university, we went through the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of those moments in global history when it really did seem quite possible that the world would blow itself up. Those were the years of a peace secured by the certainty that both East and West had, that if either of them chanced their arm, the result would be planetary catastrophe. It was called mutually assured destruction, or to use the acronym MAD. And when I'm told nowadays that the world is a much more dangerous place than it's been in the past, I can't help thinking back to those days when we seemed to be walking along the edge of a precipice with nuclear holocaust, nuclear Armageddon on one side. My parents weren't great readers. I can remember they had a few Reader's Digest published novels in our glass-fronted bookcase, and one of them was a book by Neville Shute called On the Beach, which was about the survival of people on a beach in New Zealand while the mushroom clouds spread across the north of the planet. That world seemed to come to an extraordinary end at the end of the 1980s. A friend of mine, who was then the Minister for Europe in Margaret Thatcher's government, to be Minister of Europe in Margaret Thatcher's government wasn't necessarily a very happy appointment. He was visiting Berlin in the course of his ministerial duties. And on the first day he was there, a young East German was shot climbing out over the wall. And my friend wanted to protest publicly about what had happened. And his advisors, the diplomats with him, said, "I really don't think you should do that, Minister. I think these things are much better handled quietly. We know how to deal with the East Berlin authorities and the East Germans. Just leave it to us." Well, as my friend said, 6 months later there was no wall, there was no East Berlin, there was no East Germany, all swept away into the ash can of history, the end of the Cold War. So was that when the modern world began? Was it when a few years earlier Deng Xiaoping took over the reins of power in China and began to unleash the extraordinary energy and enterprise of 1.25 billion people? Was that when the modern world began? In the early 1990s, Francis Fukuyama, the American political scientist, wrote a book, you'll remember, which was called The End of History, in which he boasted that liberal economic and political values had won the day, that we would see no more wars between states, that serious political argument was over. And shortly after, another political scientist, Samuel Huntington, wrote a book cautioning against that proposition, saying that perhaps we wouldn't find ourselves in the future with battles between states, but that we were faced with a clash of civilizations with religions, civilizations, ethnicities at one another's throats. And when those aeroplanes smashed into the Twin Towers and into the Pentagon like precision-guided munitions, it seemed then to a lot of people that that's when the 21st century, that's when the modern world was beginning, with the clash of civilizations which Samuel Huntington had warned about. Or maybe we think that we're seeing a change of era, the world spinning off in a new direction this autumn, with the most astonishing events. For example, Alan Greenspan admitting to a flaw in his thinking. The financial meltdown, the humiliation of the masters of the universe, is certainly going to lead to pretty calamitous economic consequences. I wrote in my book that the first law of economics, to which I subscribe, as enunciated by Herb Stein, was that things that can't go on forever don't. And what we've seen in the United States over the last 30 years is pretty flat average earnings, but at the same time, a reluctance of American domestic consumers to face up to what J.K. Galbraith described as their inability to accept the concept of reasonable sufficiency. And the American consumer has bridged the gulf between those flat earnings and the American dream by borrowing spectacular amounts of money. Household debt in America at the beginning of that period stood at $680 billion. Today it stands at $14 trillion. American households have on average 13 credit cards each, with 40% of them actually carrying debt. At the same time, the American national debt has risen to $10 trillion, doubling since the beginning of the century. That great mountain of debt, and in my own country, while the figures aren't as large, we've been almost equally guilty. That great mountain of debt, or what we have to call nowadays leveraging, that great mountain of debt sustained by financial instruments which were, as it turned out, not only incomprehensible to you and me, but incomprehensible to the people who traded them as well. I remember a young man about 18 months ago explaining to me how it was that the mortgage of an unemployed single parent in Alabama could be sliced and diced and morphed into a special investment vehicle which could be happily traded in Shanghai or Singapore or Hong Kong or Frankfurt or New York. I hadn't got the faintest idea what he was talking about. Unfortunately, it turned out that neither did he. He worked, it's a sad story, he worked for Lehman Brothers, as it turned out. So a combination of that mountain of debt and a failure to regulate instruments which the normal market regulators didn't comprehend, plus common or garden greed and fear, have produced the biggest financial crisis in our lifetimes, with economic consequences and political consequences which will reverberate. I don't think that we're witnessing the death of capitalism. I don't think that it's the time to relearn the words of the Socialist International. But I do think it will be some time, as Congressman Barney Franks pointed out, before anybody again tells what was President Reagan's favorite joke, that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language were, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help you." We'll have, I'm sure, a great deal of discussion about global financial architecture. It's easier for prime ministers and finance ministers to talk about global financial architecture than to run a decent, conservative fiscal policy. And some things clearly need to be done. The G8 is an absurdity. We plainly need the IMF, the World Bank, and the other institutions of global economic governance to give a proper place at the table to the emerging economies, particularly to China, India, and Brazil, but others too. That needs to be done, and I'm sure we'll see emerging from the discussions of the coming months an agreement that we should strengthen the surveillance of the IMF over international economies. But it should be remembered that the IMF have been pointing out for years that America and Britain and other countries were borrowing too much money, and the governments of those countries did nothing about it. One thing we can be sure about is the truth of Flaubert's remark. At the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War, Flaubert said, the great novelist, Flaubert said, when this is all over, we shall still be stupid. And I'm sure that is true. But in the meantime, it will certainly be impossible for America, for Europe, and for others to insist that financial deregulation should piggyback on the opening up of markets in tradable goods. I very much hope that we won't see America and Europe turning in a protectionist direction and throwing out all that's good about globalization with some of what is bad. Which brings me to the main thrust of my argument in what I guess we can call the modern world. I just hope there's nothing else which obliges me to change these paragraphs in the coming months. How will that modern world be shaped, and who principally will shape it? There remains, despite the incontinent draining away of treasure and blood in what Winston Churchill called the thankless deserts of Mesopotamia, despite the humiliation of Wall Street, despite the loss of moral authority at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, it remains the case that the United States is the only global superpower. It's the only country which matters everywhere. Open a newspaper from Bangkok to Bogota, and you'll find something about the United States on almost every page. My own view is that if you want to see your own country disappear, you go to America and open an American newspaper. But America matters absolutely everywhere. America has dominance of the global commons in a military sense, spending as much, after all, on military technology as everyone else put together. Space, air, land, sea. America also has still extraordinary economic vitality. And my own view is that while some Europeans will say, well, all this problem started in the United States, my own view is the United States will probably recover more rapidly, for example, than my own country. And America still has enormous quantities of soft power. And I think that it would not be long before, shall we say, a President Obama was able to re-establish America as a global leader with the authority that goes with opportunity and excellence. So America will, I hope, be the principal agent in dealing with the problems which I'm going to turn to in a moment. And we certainly need America to take that leading role, because nobody else will. We followed the hapless first 4 years of unilateralism under President Bush and Mr. Cheney, with 4 years of drift. And there isn't a problem I can think of which has got easier to solve during that period. So President Obama will have a large agenda, and one which I hope won't be distorted, as I mentioned just now, by pressures of protectionism in Congress. I think it would be a tragedy if a new American administration was to prove multilateralist in foreign and security policy, but unilateralist in economic policy. Second, Europe will play a role in shaping the new world. Europe is a substantial civilian power. It's not a military power, and it's not going to be a military superpower. Some American critics, like Robert Kagan, criticize Europe for being Venus rather than Mars. And there is a simple answer to that, namely that we tried Mars, and the consequences were pretty horrendous. One of the reasons why we are not a military superpower and won't be is because we don't, in Europe, probably with the exception of Britain and France, spend enough on defence. Certainly the Germans don't spend enough on defence. But I can't help thinking to myself that my grandparents' generation worried that the Germans spent too much on armaments. My father's generation worried that the Germans spent too much on armaments. And I sort of think it's better to worry about the Germans not spending enough on armaments. I think that's a step, by and large, in the right direction. Europe still has huge potential to share in global leadership, in economic issues, in trade, in development policy, and I fear that the main victims of what is happening financially around the world may be those poorest African countries which will see their development budgets slashed, and of course in environmental policy, which is going to matter so much more in the years ahead. But Europe has one big demographic challenge, which it hasn't yet, I think, sufficiently confronted. The European population will fall by 20% between now and the middle of the century, and it will fall particularly steeply in those countries with the most traditional Catholic social values: Poland, Italy, Spain. At the same time as the population is falling, it's also aging. And if Europe is to avoid a situation in the next few decades in which it has a falling share of world trade, a falling share of world population, and a falling share of world output, then it's going to have to do something fundamental to increase its rate of economic growth. But there Europeans and European voters have a problem. I think rightly they identify their standard of living, their quality of life, as the best in the world. And they're very nervous about doing anything which may change it. It makes them resistant to reform. There's a wonderful line in the greatest political novel written by a European, in my view, Lampedusa's great novel, The Leopard, in which one of the characters says, things have to change in order to remain the same. And there's a great reluctance in Europe to accept that proposition. Thirdly, clearly, Asia is going to be a major player in shaping the 21st century. Again, there's a tendency in the West, in Europe and America, to talk about the rise of Asia as though this is some new phenomenon. But if you look at the work of the person I regard as the greatest modern economic historian, Angus Maddison, if you look at his work, you're reminded that until 1820 in the Industrial Revolution, India and China together represented over 50% of the world's GDP. China about 33% and India 16-17%. China has been the largest economy in the world for 18 out of the last 20 centuries, and it will be again in this century, though not in terms of per capita GDP. Indeed, in terms of per capita GDP, I doubt today whether it would come in the first division. So India and China are re-emerging, not emerging. And the story I don't have to tell in any great detail in Singapore. I don't have to do what I've spent years doing with audiences in Europe and America, reeling off gee whiz statistics which wow all and sundry. For me, there's one very simple anecdote, two very simple anecdotes about the re-emergence of China. The first is my first sighting of China. I was a young member of Parliament and went, as chance would have it, in 1979 to Hong Kong on a visit to our territory, as we used to euphemistically call the colony of Hong Kong. And we were taken up to the police post on the border in the new territories at a place called Lo Wu, and shown over the police post the China of the millennia, the willow pattern view of China, a sleepy fishing village called Shenzhen, with slow-moving sailing barges on the river, duck ponds, a few peasants on those, what were they called, flying pigeon bikes. Well, you go to the border and look at Shenzhen today, and it's Adam Smith out of Hieronymus Bosch. That was about 10 years after the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution which destroyed the education of a whole generation. Now, 40 years on, we have at Oxford University 743 Chinese students. 42% of our maths undergraduates and postgraduates are Chinese. And I sometimes say to British audiences, and we worry about competition from Polish plumbers. So China is a transformation. China has become the workshop of the world and more besides. And India has escaped what Indians themselves called the Hindu rate of growth, partly because of the reforms introduced by Manmohan Singh, an Oxford alumnus, I'm proud to say, in response to the foreign exchange crisis in the early 1990s. India has been more successful in some respects than China in establishing global brands, in establishing multinationals, though it only exports about 1/7 of China's figure in marketable goods, it's done extraordinarily well in information technology, in pharmaceuticals, in back office outsourcing. It's elbowed its way into the category described by Goldman Sachs of BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China. I have my doubts about Russia, but we may come to that later. So extraordinary success in both India and China. But forgive me if I'm reluctant sometimes to accept graphs which show lines simply continuing exponentially into the future, as though nothing ever happened. One of my favorite pictures in my book is of the Archduke and his wife on St. Vitus's Day in 1914, setting out for their ill-fated drive in Sarajevo. One wants to say, stop. The car's going to take the wrong turn. There's a mad young Serbian student out there waiting to shoot you. So I can't help, when I'm told about those lines on the graph, I can't help but remember that it's only 20 years ago that 6 out of the 10 largest banks in the world were Japanese. 20 years ago that Sumitomo bought a huge chunk of Goldman Sachs. And both India and China, of course, face problems, as you would expect. In China, social equity, in particular the divide between rural and urban living. If you look at child mortality statistics, in the poorest rural areas, Chinese mortality statistics for children are about on a par with the Congo. In urban areas, they're about on a par with Mexico. Environmental degradation, with 16 out of the 20 most polluted cities in the world in China. And a point which I won't elaborate, but an almost existential question of how China sometime is going to bring its political structures into line with what has been happening economically and socially. It's a point that's been opened up once or twice, rather bravely in my view, by Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, for example, in relation to the recent melamine case and the importance of accountability in any governing system. In India, the problems are different and perhaps not existential, but there are serious problems of infrastructure. There are serious problems in the labour market. Indians very often talk about the demographic boon that they have a population which is growing faster than in China and is younger than the Chinese population. That's fine, provided you're producing jobs for those young people. But what is called today a demographic boon could easily become a demographic time bomb if further labour market reform is prevented by, among others, the Communist Party, which in India, unlike in China, still believes in communism. There are also social issues, for example, the Naxalite insurgency, which covers or which affects a surprisingly large number of Indian states. My overall back of an envelope summation is that in many respects I think the party state in China is too strong, and in many respects the state in India is too weak. Nevertheless, India and China will play a major role in the next decades in shaping the world we live in, and unless the transatlantic community, America and Europe, recognize that and adjust to that, then there is hardly a single problem that we'll be able to tackle satisfactorily. And fourth, there is an agency which is shaping our affairs, which is called globalization, which is simply the relationship between demography, between population growth, and the economic growth and the trade growth necessary to sustain it. But the impacts of globalization increase as technology quickens and augments them. From 1500 to 1820, world trade grew at about 1% a year. Since 1820, it's grown on average at 3.5% a year. We saw a great surge in globalization from the later decades of the 19th century to shortly before the First World War. And it was driven by a number of factors. It was driven by the opening up of the Midwest in America, exemplified by the building of Chicago. It was triggered by the successful British championing of free trade. And it was driven too by the impact of technology on productivity. The telegraph, the steamship, and the railway engine. Now, we've seen in the last few years a similar outburst of globalization. We've seen that triggered, first of all, by China and India joining the global economy. 2.5 billion people in the global marketplace. It's been pressed as well by trade liberalization, by dismantling trade barriers. When Professor Wang and I were in Hong Kong at about the same time, China's average tariffs against imports from the rest of the world stood at about 41%. I would guess that Chinese tariffs today, after access to the WTO, are at about 5 or 6%. It's an extraordinary change. So we've seen a dismantling of trade barriers, and we've seen as well once more the impact of technology on productivity, this time air travel, containerization, the internet, information technology as a whole. And both those periods of globalization lifted people out of poverty with a deflationary boom. One reason why America managed to cope with the degree of social inequity we've seen in the last few years, one reason why America managed to cope with flat average earnings, not producing huge political upset, was that the goods that America was buying from China were falling in price. Over a period of 10 years, textiles, clothing and shoes fell by 30% in the United States. Walmart, for several years after 2000, was a bigger trade partner of China than either Russia or Australia. Globalization has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. But the agents of globalization, the things which have enabled goods, money, ideas, people to move around the world more rapidly, have also allowed some of the perils to nation states to move around the world more rapidly and to increase in scale. So globalization hasn't destroyed the nation state. What it has done is to demonstrate the porous nature of national frontiers, and what it's demonstrated is that nation states have to cooperate in order to deal with those challenges. The 9/11 hijackers used credit cards to fund their operation. Money is laundered through banking systems which have been opened up over recent years. Containerization moves all sorts of goods around the world, including counterfeit goods and slaves, the modern slave trade worth about 30 billion a year. On the whole, drugs are moved around the world using commercial airlines and commercial transport. and the drugs business now is worth on the streets 300 billion. Epidemic disease moves, as we recall from the SARS disaster. Epidemic disease moves more rapidly than it has done before. And we were very lucky in retrospect that the infected SARS patients, SARS victims, landed in Toronto rather than in, say, Durban or Lagos, where their infection wouldn't have been picked up so rapidly and would have spread like wildfire. So there's a dark side of globalization: the small arms trade, terrorism, nuclear proliferation. A dark side of globalization which requires greater cooperation between nation states, the sort of cooperation that we're seeing now in trying to tackle the financial meltdown. And my simple case is that, as Tommy said, the nation state hasn't been destroyed, but that we need to look at the notion of sovereignty in different ways and need to recognize that nation states can only deliver what their citizens expect by working more effectively together. And I guess it's true to say that one of the reasons why I wrote this book was I felt provoked into doing so by the unilateralism of the first Bush administration. I'll just make two other points. First of all, we have as an international community to find a way of dealing with failed and failing states. States which either use their sovereignty to oppress their own citizens, like Zimbabwe or Burma, or states which can't use their sovereignty to protect their citizens at all, like the Congo, where 5 million people have now died in fighting over the last few years, fighting over pillaged resources, or states which, frankly, trade their sovereignty, for example, to launder money, or in the case of Tuvalu, to sell their international telephone code for phone sex operators. Or states which use their sovereignty to support terrorist organizations. Until 2001, I always thought that Afghanistan was less a state that supported terrorism as a terrorist organization which had a state. We have to find a way globally through the United Nations of coping with this phenomenon of failed and failing states, because you cannot ghettoize them, and they are invariably the place where global challenges which pollute their regional environments are incubated. And the final issue, and the biggest issue facing all of us, is the question of climate change and global warming. An issue which is going to need extraordinarily skilled diplomacy if we're to resolve it. An issue which is going to demand of developed economies a recognition of our historic responsibility for what has already been pumped into the atmosphere, but is also going to require of emerging economies some recognition that they need to at least start to address the issues alongside the developed economies of Europe, America, Australia, Canada, and so on. I think it's a huge ask of a President Obama and a President Hu to agree in the sort of timescale which is expected a deal on climate change. But what is for certain is that unless there's an understanding between China and America, there won't be a successful follow-up to the Kyoto Protocol. In an ideal world, President Obama would deal with the problems of Palestine and Israel in the sort of way suggested by Prime Minister Olmert when he was demitting office, so that he could concentrate a little more on America's relationship with Asia, which seems to me to have been badly ignored over the last few years. I've been accused in this book, while people have on the whole been gratifyingly flattering about it, I've been accused by some of being too pessimistic and some of being too optimistic, even Panglossian. My view is pretty simple, that to set out the problems that we face in fairly stark detail, though taking account of their historical roots, doesn't mean that we're staggering towards an earth wreck. We can actually solve these problems. And to say that we can solve them doesn't suggest, I believe, a sort of wacky excess of optimism. We've got through worse problems and difficulties in the past. But what is required is bold political leadership and courageous political leadership. And that entails, it seems to me, above all, treating the average man and woman as rather better than the average, of actually trying to appeal to our better judgment rather than to appeal to our baser motives. So let's hope that we find some political leaders in America and Europe and Asia who can do that. And then I'll be able to write my next book about my relationship with my grandchildren.
Brilliant lecture by Lord Patten. We have about 20 minutes for a Q&A session. I invite questions from the audience. Ken, you want to ask the first question? Yeah, come, ask the first question. Kenneth Paul Tan is one of the rising stars of political science in Singapore. So I'm sure we'll get a brilliant question from him.
Actually, I've come up to encourage some others to ask the first question and thereby give me some time to think of a brilliant question. I was about to ask the question, but you described me as brilliant, so now I have to actually take a bit of time to do so. So may I encourage another questioner to
We'll
come
wait for
forward?
your brilliance.
I'll ask the first question. I'll ask the first question. Climate change.
Yeah.
The problem with climate change is that the enemy is invisible. The impact is going to be gradual, and the major disaster will not hit us maybe for another few decades. So how do we convince politicians that they should act now rather than wait until a disaster hits us? Because human nature is perverse. We will not act until we are hit with a disaster. How do we persuade the governments in America, in Asia, to do what your government did yesterday, which is to unilaterally announce that it intends to reduce CO2 emission by 80% by the year 2050? And I'm not sure how that's achievable. I mean, if you were speaking to Manmohan Singh and if you were speaking to Manmohan Singh and Hu Jintao or Wen Jiabao, how do you convince them that India and China need to make this transition to a low-carbon economy and that they can do that without sacrificing the imperative of growth and poverty elevation?
It's certainly true that it's easier to get politicians to take bold decisions when the evidence of impending calamity is all around them. So that, for example, we were able to toughen up the Montreal Protocol on ozone depletion because there was absolutely clear evidence of what the hole in the ozone layer was doing to cancer figures in Australia, in Chile, and in other southern hemisphere countries as well. But it triggers this thought that at the time, Australia, for very good reasons, was pressing as hard as anyone for us operating on the precautionary principle in science, acting before everything was absolutely 100% clear, and accepted that the developed economies should operate first, should jump first, because we were more responsible, because we'd been using CFCs and halons for so much longer. When it came to carbon dioxide emissions, it was disappointing that the Australian government at the time took a very different point of view and argued that it would be unfair to put Australia at a disadvantage vis-à-vis business in Indonesia or whatever. A proposition which I always thought was pretty dodgy and doubtful. Now the Australian government has, and it's a very welcome change, changed its position. And I think that the evidence of climatic change was one of the reasons for doing that. Drought in Australia, the impact on Australia's agricultural economy, the impact on the Murray River Basin, the impact on the wheat crop in southwest Australia. I think all those things helped, along with a magnificent book by somebody called Tim Flannery called The Weathermakers. I think all that helped change Australian public attitudes. And I think there are plenty of examples of existing evidence of climatic change. 4 years ago, the then government chief scientific officer in Britain, a man called David King, a very distinguished scientist, chemist, now I'm pleased to say at Oxford University. David King said that he thought that climate change was a bigger threat to the international community than terrorism. And he got terribly strongly criticized, but it was true. There aren't any terrorists who are capable, so far as I know, of melting the permafrost. There aren't any terrorists who could change the Atlantic weather patterns in a way that prolongs the drought in Sudan, Darfur. There aren't any terrorists who can do anything about glacier melt. And what I think is going to attract a good deal of attention on the part of Indian and Chinese policymakers is that 6 of their great rivers rise on the Tibetan Plateau and will be hugely affected by glacier melt in the years ahead. Already some of them rivers which don't get to the sea for parts of the year. Now, we are, I think, in the future going to be at schools like this studying, perhaps you do already, studying far more vigorously the relationship between maldistribution of resources and conflict. And water will be just such an example. I bet you now there are military strategists in India and China looking at the dangers if either side tried to divert the headwaters of those 6 rivers on the Tibetan Plateau. So my simple answer to your question is that I think politicians and the public are going to see increasing evidence of what is probably climate change, which will encourage them to be bolder than they might otherwise be. We've seen, I think, 11 out of the last 12 summers in Europe have been the hottest on record. We've seen extraordinarily climatic changes in my own country with storms and floods. So I think in a political sense, the mercury in the barometer is going up pretty rapidly.
Can you ready? Let me ask you another question about the demographic deficit in Europe. You said that the European population will decline by about 20% by 2050. Yeah. Why can't Europe do what the Americans do, which is to import 2 to 3 million immigrants a year? Why is Europe having such a hard time assimilating some of the immigrant populations in Germany, in France, even in your own country, Britain?
Partly because it's smaller. I mean, if you take the most densely populated states in the United States of America in the Northeast, their level of population density is well below the levels of population density in England. And you could make similar points around Europe. So that is at least part of an explanation. But you're entirely right that a difference between America and Europe is that the American population is increasing by 1% a year, that is almost entirely the result of immigration not any longer from Europe, but from Latin America and Asia. In Europe, we need migrant labor to perform certain tasks, and some countries need it more than others. We also often need migrant labor because of the economic and trade policies that we've pursued. Example, we're not nearly sufficiently open to agricultural products from south of the Mediterranean into the European market. So since we don't allow their tomatoes or olives into Europe in sufficient quantities, we get their illegal labor instead. And we get their illegal labor in southern Spain, harvesting crops which have to be grown under plastic bags with water brought down from the north of Spain to the south at great expense. It's lunatic economics and lunatic social policy.
Okay, Kenneth?
Just a very practical question. You said that you'd like very much to see a public policy school at Oxford. And as someone who is part of a team who's looking at this public policy school and trying to figure out how to make it even better, I'd be very interested to hear what sort of visions you might have for a public policy school in Oxford. What could a place like Oxford with traditional strengths and disciplines like history and so on offer to public policy makers? I ask this because very often in public policy schools, disciplines like history don't feature very strongly, and yet history offers all manner of explanatory and even prescriptive potential. So could you perhaps outline your vision of a public policy school?
Yeah. I'll just make two simple points. The first is, my vision would be of a public policy school which wasn't focused solely on public policy in America or Europe. I don't think that we would be adding value if we simply tried to replicate what happens at Harvard or what happens in one or two other places. I think it would be imperative for us to develop a public policy school which was global in its scope and in its interest. And if I had my, the Chancellor of Oxford University is a role in which impotence is assuaged by magnificence, in the words of one of my predecessors. So I don't get to actually run things. That's the Vice Chancellor, though I'm occasionally listened to. But if I had my way, I would have a public policy school which was actually run by a non-Brit and non-American. The second point is very important, because I think it's vital for us in universities to do more than we have in the past to crossbreed disciplines and to work to work across disciplines. We've done that, or we're starting to do that, I think, successfully in an institute at Oxford where the ambassador has been an advisor, the James Martin 21st Century School, where we are getting, for example, epidemiologists to work with experts on migration and experts on international law, getting engineers to work with lawyers, getting genuine cross-fertilization. And I think it's starting to have some extremely beneficial effects. So I would also hope that a School of Public Policy could draw on some of the tremendous strengths in social sciences at Oxford University and in the sciences as well. I mean, we have other challenges. We have the challenge of providing better funding for our postgraduate courses. I mean, we could meet that challenge by cutting the number of PhDs that we provide. We at present, I guess, examine about 250, 260 more PhDs a year than Harvard. But Harvard, because it doesn't have as many PhDs, and other American universities are the same, fund them better. And I want us to raise more money so that we'll have in our School of Public Policy more people doing postgraduate degrees with 100% funding.
Okay, we'll take a few questions. Please come to the microphone. And you too. We'll just take 3 more questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Koh. Lord Chris Patten, is a rare opportunity indeed to be able to hear the wisdom of your experience. I would like to ask, in the long and tortuous political history of mankind, we have the Pax Romana of conquest, the Pax Hispanica of golden treasure, the Pax Britannica of enlightenment and beneficence, and last but not least, the Pax Americana of democracy. As China has proffered peace and goodwill in the concept of a harmonious world, do you, Lord Patten, see a Pax Sinaitica of peace in the East, and the clash of civilization between East and the West will be a myth? Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a very good question. I think that we would stand the best chance of having a Pax Humanitas if we were each of us who, and you generously referred to my own country, if we were each more honest about our own history. I have no difficulty at all with those historians who point out some of what was indefensible and awful about the Pax Britannica, about the British Empire. I mean, I've written in my book that we were pretty good at laying railway lines in India, but we were pretty murderous when we thought our interests were on the line as well, for example, at Amritsar. So I think it's an important part of a civilized society's development to look honestly at its own history. I think the Americans do that to an astonishing degree. I mean, I was reading yesterday a piece by Henry Kissinger about the Vietnam War. I hope the Chinese will do that too. I mean, Chinese history has not been about, gosh, why am I saying this with Professor Wang in the audience? Chinese history is not about one society of the same size, which has never changed, which has been continuous. I think I'm right in saying that China today is about twice the size that it was during the, not just in population, but in territory, that it was at the beginning of the Ming. So we should, I think, all be rather more honest about our histories, and then there'd be a better chance of having the sort of pacts which you rightly identify. But I hope we will learn from China some of the real lessons of Confucianism, and had Confucius been listened to recently, we wouldn't have had the rout of the financial markets, for example.
I like the Pax Humanitas. Yes?
Hello, Lord Patten. Thank you very much for your illuminating talk about current affairs and history. My name is John Roberts. I'm an MPP student here at LKY. You talked a bit about the military spending of America and the lack of desire to do so from a European perspective, and we all know about China's professed desire to rise Heping. You did kind of briefly mention Russia. Do you feel that Russia prevents or will prevent the possibility of a peaceful Pax Humanitas because of their, I want to say ego, or because of the general view of the self from a Russian perspective?
Well, I'll come clean on Russia. I'll come clean on Mr. Putin. I dealt with Mr. Putin quite a lot when I was a European commissioner, and I never felt that when I was looking into his eyes I could see his soul. I remembered, I think it was Tsar Nicholas II who said exactly the same thing about Rasputin that President Bush said about Mr. Putin. I think, I can't remember who it was who said you can take the man out of the KGB, but you can't take the KGB out of the man. I think that Russia, despite the braggadocio of the last few years, has been led in a fundamentally wrong direction. And that with the collapse in the price of oil, and with increasing difficulties in extracting gas in the quantities required in order to meet contractual obligations, I think Russia is going to have quite a lot of trouble in the next few years in holding its social infrastructure together. I've never felt that Russia was a power in the sense that China and India and Brazil are. I mean, could anybody in the audience who's got anything Russian in their house put their hand up?
Tchaikovsky?
Tchaikovsky, yes.
Tchaikovsky.
Yeah, okay, I'll give you Tchaikovsky. And I'll give you any other sorry? Yeah, well, you've got, and vodka, yeah. The latest of which is called Kalashnikov. No, it's a serious point. I mean, there are great Russian novelists.
But Russia has a high civilization.
Yes, it does. It does, and I don't think Mr. Putin is added to it. If you take a crude economic comparison, Russia, even with oil and gas at peak prices, the Russian economy is smaller than Spain's. And in terms of per capita GDP, it's a lot smaller than Spain's. Now, I think China, India, Southeast Asia are going to shape the 21st century, but I'm not sure in what sense Russia is going to. What we have to do is to try to persuade Russia that it has a better role in the world than simply making trouble. And that it should settle for being a part of the broader, it's not going to be part of the European Union, because it wouldn't want to be, but part of the European family, which doesn't feel that it has to apply pressure in a sort of Tsarist way on all its neighbours, in effect limiting their sovereignty and trying to operate like a 19th century post-Congress of Vienna power with spheres of influence around its borders. It's just not tolerable. It's not the way a modern state should operate. But I think Russia has some big problems in the years ahead. Demography, with a falling population, terrible mortality rates, particularly among young men. Partly because of alcohol, a violent and criminal recent past, and a rather unsavory relationship between big business, the security services, and organized crime. I think it's going to be very difficult for the Russians to cope with a lower price for energy, and I would just hope that for a change, because it's been a leitmotif through Russian history, for a change the Russians would start to believe in strong institutions rather than strong men.
Yes. Lord Patten, you've been a strong advocate of democracy in the Greater China region. Now, but observing what happened in Taiwan, for the with the rise of Taiwanese nationalism since they introduced democracy, would you think that one of the easiest way for a politician to gain popularity in China, if ever democracy happened in China, is to advocate revenge against the Japanese? In that case, maybe one of the safest place to be is to be on a beach in New Zealand. Thank you.
The danger of it.
Well, I don't myself think that the absence of democracy in China has prevented an occasionally worrying growth of nationalism in China. I sometimes indeed think that since communism is no longer advocated in a Marxist-Leninist way, and since communism has lost its moral core, nationalism has often been wheeled on as a substitute. I mean, it would be very difficult with a straight face to explain what the intellectual components were of Chinese communism today. There's a little book which may have been published here, I'm not sure, which was published in Europe last year, called rather bravely What China Thinks, which was an attempt by a European scholar to visit all the main think tanks in China and to ask people to explain where they thought they were going and what their political philosophy was. And it produced some fairly vacuous answers. I don't blame, to be frank, China as much in the context of Chinese-Japanese relations as I blame Japan. I mean, I think it is extraordinary that I still get sent academic magazines about foreign policy from Japan, which include articles by retired diplomats and others trying to explain away what happened in Nanjing, and trying to argue that actually it wasn't N,000 who were murdered, it was only N-Y,000, and brackets, maybe it didn't even happen at all. I mean, I think it is quite astonishing that the Japanese apologies for behavior in the Second World War have been so attenuated, to put it politely. I've been to Nanjing. I thought it was astonishingly moving. And I thought one of the reasons why it was so powerful was actually because the Chinese authorities had not overdone the explanation of sentiments which you would come away with anyway, having seen things with your own eyes. Japan behaved appallingly in China during the 1930s and the Second World War and elsewhere. And I think Japan would be a much happier society if that had been more resolutely recognized. And here I pay a great tribute to the Germans, both with their most recent history and with their history before that. In the last couple of years, there have been two extraordinarily outstanding films made by Germans, one about Hitler's end, called Downfall, the other about the Stasi state in East Germany, both of them excoriatingly truthful about Germany's past. And I think that is one of the reasons why Germany has become such a solid, some would say too solid, a democracy with a very strong civil society. So I would hope that Japan and China could reach the sort of reconciliation which France and Germany have reached. But it's going to need, I think, a lot more openness and transparency and generosity of spirit on the part of some Japanese politicians. Just add one point. The main trigger for the European Union, which is an extraordinary institution, far from perfect, but an astonishing sharing of sovereignty and in a way, transformation of sovereignty. The trigger for it all was the reconciliation between France and Germany. People should never forget, even though as an imperial power we drew others into that conflict, that it was a European civil war. My wife's father was killed just after D-Day. Actually, she discovered a couple of years ago, not by the Germans, but by the Royal Air Force. The friendly fire incident, as it's called. But he was an Olympic athlete. He ran in the 1936 Olympics. Was at Cambridge in the generation after the Chariots of Fire runners. And on his war memorial at his college in Cambridge, there are, of course, British names, American, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and German. Because what we were doing for before both those terrible wars was bringing together the best and the brightest from across Europe to study the humanities, the classical tradition, our great works of literature and art together, and then they went home and learned how to kill one another. So, ending that reconciliation, the photograph of Chancellor Kohl and President Mitterrand, who hadn't really liked one another up to that point, the photograph of them at the ossuary at Verdun, looking at those piles of bones dug up from the First World War, was in a sense the kernel of the story of the European Union. And sooner or later, there will have to be that sort of reconciliation between Japan and China. Until there is, America will be drawn slightly against its will into holding the peace between the two. But unless that happens, sooner or later, there'll be a lot more than tension.
Good point. Well, it's one of ASEAN's aspirations to bring these two great countries, China and Japan, into reconciliation. I must bring this to an end. Colonel Chopra had given me 4:15. I've exceeded the time. You will agree with me that this has been a tour de force, thoughtful, candid, and wise. And I hope you'll go out and buy a copy of the book. Thank you all very much. Kishore wants to give you this book, which is the autograph.
I was in Colombia earlier in the year. He'd just been there talking about it.
And I want to give you this book on the trees.
Oh, thank you.
Because you're asking me about the rain tree.